but also to think about how to carry it forward. If there's anything that I think symbolizes Casey's work, is that he was always sort of one step ahead of the rest of us. And if we could use this opportunity to carry on the work he has done over the course of his career, then I think we would be very proud of this session. I first met Casey, obviously, when I got to MIT, and he was already in the master's program. And as someone who heard me say before, it was quite a story because he wanted to become a mediator in the work of John Dunlop, and I guess that sort of broke off on him. And I said, no, Casey, recognizing his obvious talent, you should be a PhD now to do that. So basically, Phyllis Wallace, who was his mentor at MIT, said to Phyllis one day, I think Casey should get a PhD, but he doesn't want to. She said, I'll talk to him. A week later, he was applying for the future. So the power of a very good, powerful, and influential woman carries forward throughout his life as well. So the other comment that I would make about Casey, just to get us started, is that there are a few graduate students over the years that we've been fortunate to have where you essentially recognize the talent, hold out a few opportunities, and then can get out of the way. Casey was clearly one of those people. I remember early on when he was interested in looking at some opportunity to link labor relations activities and processes to some performance outcome. And my friend Bob Kersey had good contacts in the paper industry. We made some contacts. He went down to Louisiana. And about 6 months later, he had a data set and understanding about the production process in paper related to performance. He really set off a whole generation of work linking various kinds of labor relations activities to economic performance. And so that's the Casey on the professional side, and then there's the Casey on the personal side, where throughout the years, our shared love for baseball, maybe for family, probably kept us in touch more than anything else. He had obvious talents for baseball, not he just had a love for baseball, but he was always very, very focused on putting the family first and then the profession. And we saw that throughout his career. So we'll celebrate the work today, but we'll look to the future and ask how do we carry on this kind of work as we move forward. So, Richard, are you ready to put your? Do you have a?
Yes, I do. I apologize to be a little late, but getting from one room to another from a different hotel is a bit of a hassle.
So we're going to start with Richard Freeman. He's going to talk about some of the early work that he and Casey did on public sector negotiations and collective bargaining. Then we're going to have Kathy Shaw from Stanford talk about their shared work on insider economics and going into the field and into firms, understanding how production processes work, and then finding good data to assess the effects of different innovations. And then the later work that Casey turned to on sports analytics will be discussed by Ann Bartel from Columbia. And then we're going to have Joel Kutcher-Gershonville and Barry Holzer offer some comments. Okay? So if we could have everybody do it inside of 20 minutes, I'll give you the warning, but let's.
This is not my home. This one. Right. Just at the very top. Casey wrote it.
There we go. Okay.
It's funny.
Okay. All right. Good. So I'm gonna just sit up here so you can see me when I start to signal or coming. Put the arm on it.
Okay. Okay, so I wanted to start with just discussing Casey's interest in public sector unions, because Grace and I got to know him best. He did not want to be an academic. He wanted to be an arbitrator or mediator. And I said, this is very, very good opportunity to my life. What can I do for him? And I thought the arbitration investigation, and I knew someone who did. So I connected him up with John Dunlop, and at that point they had this joint labor management committee, which is in the state of Massachusetts, which was, Dunlop was head of that, because he's head of multiple other things. And from discussions with Dunlop, they didn't have data, there was a little bit of a, I know that this is the way they settled it in somewhere, and so we'll settle this other one. But Dunlop wanted to really get information, and so I took them, and then Casey's first job, I think, out of college, was as the research, I don't know what they call it exactly, but as research director. He was the only person doing research for this committee, and it involved establishing a database. He would go around the state, collecting data, talking to people, getting data, etc. for this committee. And say a little more about why he decided that was not a great career for him. There was a lot of old boy networks and stuff. If you're a young, empirically oriented, academically oriented person, that was not quite the right thing. So then he decided to go on to graduate school. And I'll be talking about his work in the public sector unions, a lot of which came out in this 1988 NPR volume of public sector workers, which is the co-editing committee. But I pointed out, people, the first time I've ever publicly admitted this, when they first asked, it was Al Reese, who was the slogan, said, could you do some work on this? And my first reaction was, well, I'm confused. I don't really care about that. I'm not interested in that subject. But then I thought, oh, I know somebody who is. And so immediately I went to Casey and said, will you be the co-leader of this project? At a point when he was relatively young in his career to be co-leading a project. But I did, and I think the F being Freeman author was not particularly interested in this. So this volume is a lot of Casey in it. And it wouldn't have happened. And he said to me, no, he's not interested. I would have said that I can't possibly, shift my attention to other things. And we would not have done what it turns out to be. Al Reese was correct. It's a great comment. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I want to talk about what the actual findings and what was done in this analysis and his role in this work. Well, this was the questions we raised. These are taken from the jointly authored introduction and summary. Well, why did the possibly the public law declining elsewhere? Well, now you change that a little bit because it's taking a lot of flack in the public sector as well as in the private. It's still much better. What is the new public sector? What people do the economy and do the labor management terms and something novel for the labor scene. Casey is solo author of one chapter, which really provided our best answer for the best analysis of the first thing, which has to do with the laws. And it is estimating the effects of the laws. And I do point out that there was in that universe, I don't know if he wrote papers by themselves. So it wasn't that, this was not odd. And we put together a public sector as part of the project, a public sector law database, which is still available, which has been updated a couple of times, and you can download it and still make use of it this days. His paper, chapter 1, is the lead paper in the thing, wasn't not so exciting title, I suppose, but it said what it's all about, proportional hazards model, It was based upon a special survey that we did for the volume, or for the research project, not the volume, for the project, which I'm going to describe later. This is a table and a graph that shows the results of that analysis. And there's more complicated tables there aren't more complicated graphs, but there are more complicated tables in the actual analysis. How you do the proportional hazard and what you were doing, blah, blah, blah. But this just showed very clearly. Categorizing the states by the bargaining laws that they had, the number of municipalities that fit into each of the bargaining laws, and then looking at the extent to which they were organized, as 1978 was our key year in the analysis, but versus how they were pre-law and after. So this is just a base, 78 is a base thing, pre-law and after law. And what you quickly see is, well, let's take states with the arbitration laws. Those are fairly strong public sector laws, and you see, okay, they were 19.7% of the municipalities had something pre the law. One of the key issues was the laws being pushed by places that already had the bargaining, and you would misread the causality. And then you see what happened of the groups that had been organized after the 1978 period. It goes 41.6%. It was a huge impact. And that's 3 years after, 6 years after. This is another way. This is based upon this is just numbers. It's just numbers that make clear what's going on. And here we see the probability of remaining non-union broken up year by year, and that's the real value of the proportional hazards they're getting it year by year. And you just see the arbitration are the places where the law is the strongest group. And the no law is there. So this is now dropping off from being, non-union. So it could have been reversed the other way. Very clean, and you read the paper. It's very short. It's clean. You read it. You say, yes, there was laws were likely to be passed where they already had some bargaining, because the unions would be stronger in pushing laws. But there clearly was, when the laws came in, bang, they had a huge effect. So that's it. Oops, let me go directly. The chapter 12 is the other chapter that Casey worked on. And this is, to my reading, this was a harder analysis to do, because this is actually asking for the whole shebang. Jeff Sachs is there's a co-author with all of this. Now, it today remains the heart of debates on public sector unions. What I took here was well, figured that, yes. I went through the four conclusions. So I'm not going to give all the somewhat complicated econometric stuff that because it's just hard. There's a lot of things going on, and you're trying to parse things out. The key distinction was between a bargaining unit, which was a group that acted in collective bargaining, and associations or organizations of when you have police or fire or other groups who can't do the bargaining. Because there could be a place where the bargaining laws is not there. And the findings, as far as, see, we've done some work, I've done 40 years now, on teachers, related to teachers data now, and the teachers was replicating some of this stuff. Bargaining union, you get an increase in pay. You get something if the union is there, or not the union, the association is there that is not bargaining, but it's much weaker. Same thing's true I don't know for the police and fire, but it's certainly teachers today. The bargaining units raise employment above what would otherwise be, so they're preserving and doing job. The associations do not do that. They lack the power to do that. And then the interesting effect on the budgets was that you've got more, if you're holding your jobs or raising your jobs and you're getting more pay, the budget is shifting towards your function. So the police is getting more money, or the fire budget is getting bigger. What we couldn't, they couldn't see, the effects on total expenditures in the city, which means a lot of this was substitution from other activities. And that cuts at the heart of some debates about are the collective bargaining unions actually creating deficit things. And And then finally, outside departments, there might be some spillover wage effects, but there you saw the employment go down. You look at this, you say, that do these results still hold today? And I think the message of things people would do today would be more sophisticated. And I think, at least in the case when we were looking at the teachers, yes. And I guess they do. So it's a really powerful thing. You think about what the whole volume was about. It was about why, which was Casey chapter 1, and about what were the effects of this form of collective bargaining, and that's Casey in chapter 12. So it really oops, thanks. Then there's another paper that I want to cite. This is Ichniowski from Larry. It's a Joel paper on municipal police departments. Because I want to explain how that data came about. And Casey got a reward for something very peculiar. And I pardon me for using the word fairly sophisticated. My name is also but it was an effort. I think it was a step better than most studies have tried to get. And are there these spillover effects? They're really hard to identify. One police department is organized versus a police department in the nearby city that is not organized. It's just a difficult thing. The claim in the paper was there were sizable spillovers in states that had strong union laws. So if you're the non-union police department in the state of Massachusetts, the threat effect is big. You'll get to be unionized. Therefore, you better get your wages up to more or less the union. That was the nature of the argument. I just put the quote here. It was done before, after a whole bunch of stuff. And it increased it. So it both the direct and the indirect effects on police unions on compensation rose when the laws were more favorable. And it was all about things. And a key thing was actually demonstrating that when a police department in a strong union state did not get high wages, that they would in fact be unionized in the future. And so you get a multiple shot at trying to show. And looking back at that, you today might have said you should have one maximum likelihood model for the whole shebang. Instead, it was done equation by equation. But I think we're convinced. Now, this survey was critical. And this was a survey done by Mr. Lauer, who was the undergraduate in this project. And I said before email, Survey Monkey, Lauer we had boxes of little envelopes going out, in little envelopes coming back from police departments, and in case he was overseeing this particular activity. And then they would call. So we Lauer would make these calls. We called 2, 3, 4 times. There wasn't a police department, there wasn't hassle to give us the data. It really is an extraordinary data set. Because he asked, since he only had one shot, there were these backward questions about, in what year did you first have a collective bargaining agreement? In what year, so you're able to do it in your history. Lauer, let me phrase this carefully, he was not one of the star Harvard economics seniors. He was one of the weaker Harvard economics seniors. And at one point we started this project, I said to Casey, I said, well, this is a really big project, but if by any chance Lauer gets the best thesis prize, you get a holiday in Sri Lanka. It's almost like out of the question. And the thesis came out, and now here's I'm in the department, so we're picking the thesis person, and I made a case. It wasn't really, I was not deeply involved in this. There was this guy who then was probably at MIT, who was helping with this project, etc. And to the surprise of me, came back.
Magic.
Oh, thanks. So, and then I made the second case. I said, hey, if you can take this student on this project, and that thesis turns out to be, really good. I was working doing this consulting things for Sri Lanka. Casey likes beaches, and he likes so we, and I paid up my dad, and we went to Sri Lanka for a revenue conference. I was working with, and that's also a sign of somebody real special. And he took an undergraduate who was not terribly good, and he didn't write the thesis at all, but he just sort of mentored him and pushed him and pushed him and pushed him until the kid wrote a really good thesis. And then the notion of trip was just a natural thing because we were close friends at that point, in any case. And that's what that.
Good. Thank you, Richard. All right, so we're going to move to insider economics, the next phase of Casey's work.
Okay, well, while we're getting started, let me just say a few words. I'm not fond of this podium here, but I guess I kind of stuck in order to see the screen. So thank you for joining us today to honor Casey. We've had 2 services for him, and they were lovely, and so we're going to talk really more about the work Casey did than about the person. But I do have to say at the outset that, Casey, I assume that if you're here, you probably knew Casey, and you knew that Casey was simply a prince among men in every respect. There was never any question that he always had time for you, always had time for personal matters, for talking about aspirations in life, for sharing family anecdotes and stories and all kinds of things. And, so as I said, he was a prince among men. I also want to mention that Ann Preston is here, which is what Tom said, and so Ann's sitting up here, Casey's wife. They met. Ann was a graduate student at Harvard when they met, and the reason I mention it's relevant to the academic work is that as Casey and I worked together, and I haven't sat down and counted the years that we worked together, maybe 25 years, I would say. Ann was always the backbone there. And, when we had a particularly difficult problem, Casey always went to Ann to double check to see how we were doing it and, whether everything was kosher and, how things were going. So, Ann was very much the partner in every respect in Casey's life. All right, so I'd like to talk about insider econometrics, but, okay, so, but, I'm going to kind of lead up to talking about that. What I'd really like to talk about and give you a sense for is Casey the person in terms of research. And Casey the person, and you can see this in what Richard was saying too, Casey the person had a passion in life, and that passion was to do research of consequence. So maybe, as a result of giving up his desire to be a mediator, he wanted to move on to do something that was really path-breaking. And so he really wanted to, and then I put in parentheses, find truth. And so all too often over my 30-some years, 35 or 40 years now of being an academic, I look at papers and I think, that's not one I wanted to write. What am I doing sitting here? Because, something hinges on a coefficient or something hinges on a theory which, doesn't seem to have any foundation in reality. And that, Casey was the opposite of that. Casey wanted everything grounded in reality, grounded in good theory, and good econometrics. And but most of all, he just wanted to find truth in everything he did. And so that's really what this is about. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about the question that we had when we began our study, which is what makes firms productive. So, I don't have too many stories about Casey, and the reason I don't have that many stories is that everything we did over the years, we did on the phone. So I'm going to talk about the steel studies, and the steel studies involve going to something like 80 different steel mills. But Casey and I divided up the trips. We each did half, and then we had a graduate student that was sort of the core who did every trip. And so so other than going to France together and Japan together and conferences together, we weren't really hiking through the steel mills together. But we were doing it all on the phone. And so our underlying theme was what makes the firms productive. And Richard and Tom talked about how Casey got started. And so let me just share with you how we got started on the steel mill projects. And so I was at Carnegie Mellon in the business school, and I'd been there a few years. And I was doing straight traditional labor economics, which wasn't particularly inspiring. And one day Dick Sire stepped down from the presidency of Carnegie Mellon and returned to the business school. And he had been solicited by the Sloan Foundation to do a study of the steel industry because the Sloan Foundation decided they wanted to have industry projects. And so they thought, well, if you're going to, so University of Pittsburgh was also interested in this. They thought, well, if we're going to study the steel industry, then obviously that's going to be Pittsburgh. And so we went to Dick Sire, and then I knew Dick Sire. Dick Sire came to me, and he said to me, do you have anything you might want to do? And I thought, oh my God, at last, I've been here a few years, at last they're going to let me do something that is both real world and actually follows businesses, and I'm in a business school. And so I thought, what a great opportunity. But I had this little handicap, which is I knew nothing about it. I never visited companies, I knew nothing about, how they operated really. And so, but in graduate school, I too had met someone, and that's Casey, who had a demonstrated record of knowing a lot about how to get inside firms and make use of data, and also had done a survey of HR practices. So I knew Casey, and so I called up Casey. And I called up Casey and I said, Casey, here's kind of the project. We want to really figure out how to revitalize the steel industry. We want to really figure out how they can, do better. This was an era where we were being beat by the Japanese and others, and the industry had really declined. And so I said to him, are you interested? And Casey immediately jumped on it. And I said, oh, Casey, but there's this little problem here, and that is that we need to write a grant proposal. And the grant proposal is due in about 2 days. And so Casey and I sat down, we divided up the work, but mostly Casey did the work. Within 2 days, I had a complete lengthy grant proposal from Casey on what it is this project should do. Because keep in mind, I didn't know much about the subject. And Casey was an expert. And so that just launched the project. We got our first $60,000 and started visiting companies with a letterhead that got us into companies. And from then on, I think the overall project, we raised about $2.5 million for the overall project. But this was the foundation. So it's about what makes firms productive, and it's about a journey with Casey. So I'm going to go through some of this journey of steel mills. And so, and Tom, I don't have a good sense of the time, and I have way too many slides. So we started visiting steel mills. And so we had no idea what we were doing, not a clue. We just knew we needed to get out there and see what was going on in the real world. And as we visited steel companies, we heard managers say two different things. We had heard one say, we tried labor management participation teams and they were a dismal failure. And that's in one plant. In the other plant, we heard that innovative participatory practices are essential to turning around the industry. And we heard that in the other plant. And what we felt is these guys are experts on running their business. And yet they're saying the opposite. How can we reconcile that in the work that we do? We needed to reconcile that. And so as you see, here's a picture of a steel mill. We also realized that steel mills are really big places. And we needed to be able to measure productivity of steel mills. And so as we walked around the mills, we realized that we needed to confine our analysis to one area of a steel mill. And it had to be an area of a steel mill that you'd see in every single steel mill that we would ever possibly visit. So that's how we settled on finishing lines, which is the bottom picture here. And our productivity measure was uptime, which is the percent of time the mill is up and running when it should be running. And so we had our productivity measure, and we started visiting. So when we started visiting steel mills, we went to about 6 steel mills. And so we just went out there, and this at the beginning, Casey and I were doing this together. And we visited about 6 mills. And after we had visited only 6 mills, we actually knew exactly what the paper, we didn't know the theory of the paper, but we knew what the paper would, in essence, be about. And that is that firms that got really innovative participatory practices or plants were just doing a whole lot better than those that had the traditional union environment. And we could just see it, just walking around the mill, you just visualized it, and you knew the HR practices, and we were conducting kind of an HR survey as we went, that we did at every place. So we were kind of tempted to stop at 6, but then we said no. You know, we're economists, and Casey, even despite his industrial relations background, was always an economist at heart. And we decided we needed to keep going on. We needed to visit every possible steel mill in the U.S. So that's what we did. We visited every mill. We got monthly data on productivity for 36 of the 41 mills we visited, and we started doing our analysis. And so let me just skip, because I'm worried about the time, to the results of this study. And so these are the results of the study that came out of the regression analysis. So what we did is we got data from every area manager in all these mills. And this was an era where you asked the manager for his uptime data. You know, as I said, that's the percent of time that mill is up and running. And he'd go to some really rundown area of his mill where he had this horribly dirty office. He'd open an old beat-up desk drawer, he'd pull it open, and he'd pull out a sheet of paper and say, here's the uptime data. And so we were getting these sheets of paper, from these mill operators, and we were coding it in. So what did we get out of the AER paper? So what we got out of the AER paper was that you could really see that if you categorized mills into 4 different categories, traditional sort of union environment, communication where you were sharing information, teams where you had some problem-solving teams, and then high performance where you had very high incentive pay and you hired people very carefully. You could see that the uptime in the traditional was 88%, so that means that they were producing scrap 12% of the time, not exactly a good way of making money when you produce scrap 12% of the time. And the top high performers were producing scrap only 5% of the time. Actually, the top performers also had slightly better mills, so they were doing better than that. So this is what we got. This is basically the AER results, and we got it from changers, and we got it from cross-sectional data. And we were able to use the cross-sectional data because these steel mills were truly identical. So we really could compare one mill to another because the capital stock in these mills really was identical. We also had measures of the capital stock. All right, so that's the paper where we reached the conclusion that that a system of high performance really raises productivity. And I want to say the other vivid memory I have, Bob Gibbons is sitting here, and Bob came to Carnegie Mellon to give a paper at the time. And we were right in the middle of the beginning of the steel mill project, and I was listening to Bob, I thought, this is what our paper's about. Our paper kind of needed a theory. And the theory became complementarity as, an inspiration from a paper Bob was giving at the time, and a couple of other papers that were out at the time, which is that you had complementarity. I have a slide for this, which meant that to really be a high-performance mill, you had to get all the practices right because they interacted. You couldn't expect someone to be a good problem solver if they didn't have incentive pay and they weren't carefully hired so they were smart. So you had to have all of these things interact. And so that's what we showed in the paper, that it was about the complementarity between HR practices. And so when I get back to those 2 quotes that I had at the outset, the way Casey and I resolved those quotes was we realized that the guy who said that I tried teams and they were a failure only tried teams, but didn't have careful hiring and didn't have incentive pay and didn't have information sharing that needed to support the teams, and that's why they failed. So they failed because they didn't have it all. All right, so that's that one paper, and so this is the paper, if you know Casey, this is probably the paper you would know. And what I want to say now is, how should you test for complementarities? The only way this paper worked was that steel mills were making mistakes. it was clear that the best thing you could do to be productive was to have all the innovative HR practices. The only way we could prove that is there were mills who hadn't realized that and hadn't gotten down their learning curve of adopting new innovative HR practices. And the only way you could prove that innovative HR practices were successful is that some mills were making mistakes. That's less true nowadays. So this is part of that era. Now, I want to stop for a moment on this slide and talk about this for a few minutes. So, though you may know the AER paper, there's actually 5 or 6 papers that we wrote to really understand what was going on, because one paper only raises other questions. And so these are summarizing the papers here, and I'll show you a few pictures from those papers. So the top there is complementary systems of innovative HR raise productivity. Then underneath that is, what do workers do differently with innovative HR? You know, what are they really doing? And the next question is, why don't all plants adopt? Because, you know, this is a case that there's a treatment. The treatment is an innovative HR practice. Why wouldn't all firms adopt these? And we have 2 papers that came out of that. So this is a slide that's going to summarize 4 papers. And so what we did to answer these additional questions and the bullet points that I have below them. And so what we did, before I show you the picture, let me go back to, so the paper on the left that came out, it is a paper where Casey and I were sitting in our office and we were working with a graduate student. We thought, if only we could just videotape these steel mills, we could prove to people that the innovative people are doing problem solving and, you know, doing their job and paying attention to steel quality, and the traditional were doing none of that. But, you know, this was an era where you didn't videotape, so we had to come up with some other solution. And the solution we came up with to figure out what was being done differently was we decided to go back to the mills and survey all the guys that were working in the mills by name and say, do you talk to other people in solving problems? Do you talk to other people about operating problems? So a guy at the beginning of the entry point of the mill, you know, do you talk to somebody further down the line about how to solve problems? And lo and behold, we went and we gathered all this data on who talks to who. So this was really, we had never heard of social networks, but, you know, we learned about social networks because that's what this is. And we got these social network graphs. And so what these graphs are, these are very busy. You probably can't see them in the back, but you should just get a sense for them. So what these are very dense social networks. And the reason you see these blue lines is each node, how much time? 2 minutes? Oh boy, each node is talking to another person. And so what you see is that in a high performance line, everyone talks to everybody. And in a low performance line, no one talks to anybody. And so we could just see what was being done differently. All right, so since Tom says I have 2 minutes, which is incredible, I'm going to move on and just talk verbally about the other papers that we did. So another paper we did is just to figure, this came out of Brookings, just to figure out why some older lines were not adopting. And basically, managers were entrenched. Managers wanted to run the line. They didn't want to give up power to operators on the line. And so old mills were not making changes. If you look at steel mills nowadays, managers of these mills have changed, and pretty much all steel mills have adopted innovative practices nowadays. The next paper we did was a paper on mini mills. And the paper on mini mills was we went and we also went to every mini mill in the US. And the reason we did the mini mill paper is because we wanted to figure out whether it was true, in fact, that all plants should adopt innovative HR. And what we found with mini mills is that certain products, so a mini mill makes steel out of recycled scrap steel, and they make bar products. And so a typical bar product would be rebar that goes in construction and then up to fancy I-bar. And what we found out is that not all mills should have innovative HR. Those that are making rebar just didn't have any problems to solve, so they didn't need participatory work practices. But those who were making high quality steel did, so we did our mini mill paper. All right, so what all this led to, oh, and I just wanted to show you one other thing. So this is a show of the data, and I wanted to mention Casey on this slide. So this is a printout of our uptime data. And so so you look at the bottom and there's numbers. So we had something like 48 mills. And the reason there's some blanks in there is some mills didn't provide data. And I wanted to mention this data because Casey was a real stickler for detail. And he knew every single data point. He knew why they adopted, why they didn't adopt, how productive they are, when they had adopted over time. And he just knew every data point. And that served us well in the many papers we wrote. Okay, so these I don't have time for. So now let me move on to insider econometrics. So in the process of doing this, we decided to start to figure out, what were we doing that would be good for the profession? And we were asked by others to start to to write papers not about so much the steel stuff or about valves, which we may have time to talk about another paper, but to really think about the methodology. And so we coined this term insider econometrics to talk about the methodology. And in insider econometrics, there is a treatment. So the goal in insider econometrics is to go inside firms and do field studies and really learn how firms function. And the goal really was to figure out how they function, and why all firms don't adopt the same practices. So there was, in insider econometrics, the method was, there was a treatment. The firms were moving to innovative HR practices. The treatment effect is the productivity that is a result of that innovative HR practice. And then there must be an adoption equation in treatment, because you have to know why some places adopt and some don't in order to understand whether you've got a treatment of the treated effect or whether you've got an average treatment effect or what's going on. So what insider econometrics does, in summary, is it really uses field studies to understand deeply what's going on in firms, and then gathers the data and the theory to prove that it's really that we've kind of found truth. That you can prove it in the data, and that there's a theory to back it up. And it also has to focus on something that's kind of a generalized good question. Okay, so here are the studies again, and here's the many mills. But what I want to go to, and this is a valve study that we did with Ann Bartel, who's here, and we have time to talk about it. So let me just show you this one slide. So this is in a paper that we wrote on insider econometrics for Bob Gibbons' volume. And so this, I'm not going to summarize this because I thought it would be more interesting to tell the story about how steel came to be. But if you're thinking about doing work in the area, we have some key features of insider econometrics that are sort of how do you do this work. And so I just want to call your attention to that volume. And Casey and I spent a lot of time hashing this out. All right, so I guess my time is up. Is that true? The time is about up? Okay, so let me come back to this. So Casey's passion, do research of consequence, find truth. So there's just no doubt that in everything he did, he definitely succeeded at this. And he is, a king, a prince among men is what I said earlier, and that's true personally, and it's true in his research. And as I was working on this presentation, I'm referring to Casey in the past tense, but Casey and I talked on the phone a lot. We had long conversations. And I find it impossible, frankly, to think of Casey in the past tense. Casey is completely present with me still today. And, I'm absolutely convinced that, because I worked on the phone and I didn't see much of him, I'm absolutely convinced that at any moment in time I'm going to be able to pick up the phone and call him again. So I'll just have to do that in my imagination, but, he's very much present with us, and in his research and in the force of his personality. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've been interested to speak about Casey's contribution to the field of sports analytics, but I'd like to start really by talking about the fact that I think I'm unique in his audience in that Casey was my colleague for 30 years at Columbia Business School. David Blue in the city in the audience, I believe, was the person responsible for recruiting Casey from MIT to Columbia Business School. And Casey and I worked very closely together, not only in research, but teaching and just being good friends. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about Casey's teaching, which we haven't spoken about, but I think also reflects Casey's passion for doing things in consequence. Let me just start by saying that Casey and I worked together with Kathy on an insider econometrics paper that Kathy referred to. And this paper, which appeared in the committee in 2007, was a study of the valves industry, or fabricated metals industry. And the focus here really was on understanding what information technology is in this industry. Up until this point, there have been many studies that use very generic measures of information technology, for example, investment in computers in an industry. And we decided to take an insider econometrics approach that basically said you got to get inside the firm to really understand what information technology is in this particular industry. So true to what Kathy was talking about before, numerous plant visits to really understand what is information technology in this industry. And once we had that understanding, we then went out and collected data. We wrote our own survey that was specifically geared to this industry, using terms that only people in this industry would be familiar with, and gathered very detailed data, not only on various measures of productivity, which were guided by our plant visits, also measures of information technology, human resource practices, and skills. And basically, the paper kind of showed how there have been changes in this industry as a result of information technology that led to kind of a comprehensive view of different types of skills that the industry was looking for in their workers, the use of innovative human resource management practices. And again, I think it's an example of Casey's passion for research of consequence and really getting down very detailed to really understand what do all these things mean in this industry. Now, there's another insider econometrics paper I'd like to talk about. Richard Freeman's sitting here today. He's a co-author on this paper. Many years ago, the Citibank Behavioral Sciences Research Council put out a call for grants looking for researchers to study human resource issues in the banking industry. And Casey, Richard, Morris Clymer, and I proposed a study that would look at the understanding how employee attitudes affected performance of bank branches. And again, it was an insider econometrics approach. Casey and I spent months and months and months going around the New York metropolitan area, spending time in bank branches. And we would see several branches in a day in a concentrated area. So if we were in Manhattan, we could kind of start at 57th and 3rd, and then we would walk 10 blocks to 47th and 3rd to spend some time in that branch. And we spent time with the managers, we spent time with the employees, and we really got to understand what is the so-called production process in a bank branch, and really got to understand what is the culture in a specific bank branch. What's really interesting here is that Citibank had a corporate human resource policy that basically said, here's what managers are supposed to do. But what we found is that when you actually spoke to the managers, you actually spoke to the people working inside the branches, each branch was really different. It was really what we called kind of a specific branch-level employee attitude in a branch. And we had very interesting econometric tests for trying to demonstrate this branch-level employee attitude. But what was important about this is that once we were able to demonstrate it, we were able to provide a convincing explanation for why a cross-sectional relationship between productivity and employee attitudes would disappear when you did a first difference or fixed effects model. Basically, there was this unmeasured thing about a branch that was correlated both with the employee attitudes in the branch and the performance of that branch. So these were two papers that I really was very fortunate to have the opportunity to work closely with Casey. Again, my experience in working on these papers with him, reiterating what we heard from Richard and Kathy, someone who really wanted to get the answer correct. Just weren't going to just take the results on face value, but really dig deep to really try to understand this. Now, what I was asked to talk about this morning is Casey's work on sports analytics. I was not a co-author on these papers. Ann Preston was Casey's co-author on these papers. And in preparing for this presentation this morning, I had the opportunity to read two really interesting, excellent papers. But the first question I want to discuss is, how did Casey get from insider econometrics to sports analytics? I think it was two things. One is, he, as we've heard before from others, he was a huge sports fan. Now, I haven't know a lot about sports. My husband is a huge sports fan. My son is a huge sports fan. Both of my sons-in-law are huge sports fans. So when the family gets together, we talk sports. So I'm not uneducated when it comes to sports. And Casey and I, sometimes we'd be sitting in the office, talking about work, so to speak, and then there'd be some discussion. I would mention something about the Yankees, and he would mention something about the Orioles, because I know that was the team that he truly loved. But what was really interesting is that Casey realized that sports was a fertile ground for doing some very interesting work in the field of what I might call organizational economics. Heretofore personnel economics, but I think the modern term being organizational economics. So he was able to take his love of sports and his desire to find answers to important research questions and move into this area. Because he and I would often talk about, well, you want to write a good paper in personnel/organizational economics, you need good data. And he and I would often try to reach out to companies to try to collect data. I remember once we thought we were going to do a project with Pfizer, and we had this big trip out to New London, Connecticut, to meet with scientists at Pfizer, spent many hours with them, follow-up calls, thinking we're going to get data, and of course you never get data. And Casey realized you got to kind of make your own data. You have to look for opportunities where you can get the data that you need. So I'm going to talk about two papers. So this first paper is the March 2012 NPE working paper. Does March Madness lead to irrational exuberance in the NBA draft, high-value employee selection decisions, and decision-making bias? So what's the personnel economics question? So yes, well, from a sports perspective, this would be an interesting paper to write, but what's the personnel economics question? The personnel economics question is something that many in this audience have studied and are interested in. How do employers make employee selection decisions? Something that we'd like to understand. Well, in order to answer that question, you need to have access to some data on what employers might look at in evaluating a potential employee and how they might compare that potential employee to other potential employees. So Casey and Ann came up with this great idea. They said, here's this really unique setting. We can assemble data based going to give us the information that employers use to assess potential employees. We're also going to have data on the actual performance of these employees once they are actually hired. So March Madness, I mean, for those of you who are not sports aficionados in this audience, but March Madness is the annual college level competition of the NCAA teams. And it's an opportunity to observe potential employees. So the professional basketball teams can observe potential employees in this high-pressure tournament and be able to use information on how these potential employees performed in the March Madness tournament to assess whether or not they should hire, i.e. draft, the player in the NBA. So the findings here. So Casey and Ann are able to identify what I call unexpected March Madness performance, which would either be unexpected team wins or unexpected player scoring. So what that would mean, for example, unexpected team wins, you would look at a team that's seeded at a certain number, and you would look at prior history of what's been the typical win pattern for a team that was seeded at that level. So that would be what you're kind of predicting this team should do in terms of how many games they should win in March Madness. And then you look at what their actual performance is. So you have this unexpected performance. And you have unexpected player scoring. So for each player in a March Madness tournament, you know what his actual performance was pre-tournament. So these different metrics in terms of your 3-point, 2-point, foul shots, passes completed, and you could look at what the person actually does in the March Madness tournament versus what he did prior to March Madness, this unexpected player performance. And then, of course, like good economists, Casey and realized, well, we've got to be careful that there could be unobservables about these potential employees that the econometrician can't observe. And they cleverly use these mock draft rankings that come out and use that as a way of controlling for the unobservable characteristics of these potential employees. And what they find, because what the paper actually poses is this question of, is it rational or irrational for the NBA teams to use this performance in March Madness to predict how someone's going to do as a future NBA player? And what they find is that players who get bumped up in the draft based on performing unexpectedly well in March Madness indeed outperform players who were drafted at the same spot in an NBA draft without any being bumped up based on March Madness performance. They actually perform better in the future, and furthermore, they go on to become NBA superstars. So in fact, it's a rational response using this information on unexpected performance in the March Madness tournament. Turns out to be a rational response. What they conclude is that it should even count to have a bigger weight in these employee selection decisions. So it's really a great paper because it gets at this question of, can you actually measure, can you actually look at the information that an employer might have about a potential employee? Can you actually show how this information is used in making a hiring decision, and then in turn, whether or not the employer made the right decision? So that's the first paper. The second paper in sports analytics, again, it may be your working paper. Do star performers produce more stars? Peer effects of learning in elite teams. So again, starting with the personnel economics question, are peer effects transitory, or are there more permanent and transferable performance increases due to high-performing coworkers? So this is something that had been previous work done on peer effects. One that I'm most familiar with is the paper by Alex Monson and Enrico Moretti that studied cashiers in a retail setting, and the idea there being that if the high-performing employee is watching over the shoulder of the lower-performing employee, you find the lower-performing employee doing better. But these are basically transitory effects, because if you take that high-performing employee away on the subsequent shift, the effects disappear. And what Casey and Ann said, maybe there might be a way of figuring out, can these peer effects be more permanent? That you can really transfer knowledge from a high-performing employee to a lower-performing employee in a more permanent way. So again, you got to find good data. Now, I don't know much about soccer, but I certainly learned a lot about soccer reading this particular paper. This is an amazing data set that Casey and Ann put together. They have data on, I believe it's about 100 national soccer teams over that 20-year time period. They have data on the performance of these soccer teams, and furthermore, they have very detailed data on the performance of the individual soccer players, very detailed metrics of soccer performance. And what appeals to me, and to those of us who study these types of topics, is that they are able to identify who works with whom in the group setting. So similar to what Kathy was talking before about the network study in Steele, they actually know which player was playing in a particular game on a particular day with other players. And what they're able to measure is what happens to a player's performance if he has the opportunity to be exposed to high-performing peers. So there's a little institutional context here to understand how they do this. This is something that I learned. The top-flight soccer players play on two teams. They play in their country's national team, and then they also play on a professional club team. So they're professional club teams that are considered to be very elite. And what Casey and Ann show is that even if you control for the composition of the roster, if you have a given national team player who joins an elite European club, then the national team performance goes up. So you think this particular player has an opportunity now to spend some time playing on an elite club, then he comes back to the national team does better. And what's really interesting here is that Casey and Anna were able to leverage something that's very interesting. There was something called the Bozeman ruling back in the mid-90s, I believe, that basically changed the way in which previously there had been limits on the number of foreign players who would be invited to join these elite teams. And the Bozeman ruling took away that limitation. So it gives them an opportunity to do very clever regression discontinuity design. Now, you might think the paper would stop right there. They demonstrated that team performance goes up when players have an opportunity to participate on an elite team. But true to form, Casey digs, and the first level is, let's look at player level performance. We got to really show that when a player joins an elite team, that he in fact is performing better. So it's very detailed data on different performance metrics in soccer, corners, headers. I wasn't even sure in terms of the definition of some of these concepts. But again, what they show is that when a player joins this elite soccer club, his own performance in the team goes up, and the key thing here, the performance of his team members go up as well. So it's by using this very detailed individual level data. But there's a third category of evidence. Again, this process of kind of digging down to really understand what's going on. Interviews with professional players. Open-ended interviews. Here's an example of a question that they asked. Can you think of one or two periods during your national team career when you felt like you improved the most, when you had a breakthrough in your performance? And what comes out of these interviews are specific examples of the mechanisms behind the peer effects. Because you really come away reading this paper saying, I believe these numbers. I really believe these results. And I think that's true of all of Casey's papers. You come away saying, I believe this. I don't have any concerns about if they missed something, there's something unmeasurable, they forgot something. I believe these papers. Let me just conclude by talking about Casey as a professor. Casey was a professor for 30 years at Columbia Business School. And when he first joined Columbia in 1984, he taught a course called Conceptual Foundations of Business. I taught that course as well. Dave taught it. And you have to remember, this is now like the mid-'80s. And this course was basically a course about institutions. It was a course about governments interacting with business interacting with labor unions, it was kind of a political economy course. It wasn't very popular with the students, but it was a required course. Then around 1990, our curriculum at the business school was revised, and this course was taken out of the core curriculum. And Casey and I and others needed to find something else to teach. So we all moved into managerial negotiations, which had just started. It was started by Jim Kuhn as a kind of, let's try a special seminar at Columbia Business School, and Jim was kind of experimenting with this, and Casey joined Jim in teaching this course, and I joined a couple of years later. And Casey did a phenomenal job at this course. I mean, this was a course where we had the opportunity to really shine. We knew the institutional context of negotiations, but he had a very clever way of really understanding what does a Columbia MBA student want to know and need to know about managerial negotiations. How do you teach this in a way that an MBA student will say, this is important? And he developed lots of very interesting materials for this course. Casey and I also had the opportunity to team teach this course several times, and I really saw firsthand how much he loved being a professor. We talked about here this morning about how much he loved research, but he really loved being a professor. We would sit around the office and he would always talk about a couple of ways to get them excited about this, kind of a unique way of teaching a concept. And he set very high standards for his students. Last January, so it's January of 2014, the third week in January, Casey and I team taught a version of this course. We have a version where it's taught in a 1-week block intensive, 5 days a week. 9 to 5. And we taught this course together during that third week in January. And then 2 weeks later, Casey unexpectedly passed away. And in February, I was grading the papers for this course. And as Kathy talked how, she had many phone conversations with Casey and still feels like she can pick up the phone and talk to him. And I'm grading these papers and I'm saying, I need to talk to Casey, but I need to get his opinion on this. Or I would come across a paper that was really outstanding and I would really want to pick up the phone or send Casey an email saying, you've got to read this paper. You are just going to love this paper. Here's a student who really got it. Just knowing how happy he would have been. It's really important to him that the students got it. Now, in red, I've highlighted here Casey's most recent course, the Management, Economics, and Professional Team Sports. This was a new course that Casey developed. He taught it in the spring of 2013. It was basically a sports industry course. Now, while true, it had a lot of stuff about labor, about unions in the sports industry, but it was much more than that. It was really kind of understanding how teams get value, just understanding the whole process of running a professional sports team. And it was, as you can imagine, hugely popular at Columbia Business School. And Casey was scheduled to teach the course again in spring of 2014. I believe he was able to attend the first class, and then unexpectedly passed away. But I know how hard he worked in terms of developing the materials for this course, and how much the students appreciated it. And he's really left a legacy for us at Columbia Business School in terms of what it means to be an effective teacher of MBAs. How you hold MBAs to a high standard, but how at the same time you still recognize the needs and interests of MBAs. At Columbia Business School, we desperately miss him. I mean, on a personal level, he was my friend, he was my colleague. I confided in him. I know that Tom mentioned earlier about Casey's love of family, and that's something that came through loud and clear. We always talked about our kids. I know he loved his annual vacations with his family. And one of the things I just want to mention, a lot of times it was kind of hard to get Casey. I would call him, we'd have to leave, we'd have to talk about something. And he's a very busy guy and got a lot on his plate. But what really impressed me is when he would say to me, I can't meet, I'm going to visit my mother in Baltimore. He made sure every week when his mother was in failing health, every week, no matter what was going on in Columbia, he made sure every week to take that trip to Baltimore, spend time with his mother, and I think it just really tells us a lot about Casey as a man. We've talked about him as a researcher, as a professor, as a friend, but he really had extremely high standards in all phases of life, and I really admired him for that. I miss him very much.
Thank you, Ann. So we'll turn to Joel and to Mary for some comments, and then we'll invite comments from other people in the room who would like to say something.
Thanks. I really appreciate all of the comments that have been made. This is not a traditional panel with papers in which a discussant has to summarize the papers. So Mary and I both agreed that we would pick some themes that cut across the topics and attempt some integration, but we can't resist. I know I can't, I'm sure Mary can't either, also speaking at a personal level. I'd really like to emphasize three things as a kind of summary discussion, and you heard it loud and clear in all the presentations. The first thing is just the thoroughness and rigor and the deep understanding of work itself that characterize Casey's work. And I just picked two papers to comment on, and you've heard some about each of them in the remarks, but in 1978, Casey wrote a paper on firefighters. Now, Casey and I are actually the exact same age, and so I know that 1978 is the year he graduated from college. Most first minted college seniors don't write world-class econometric papers. But up until then, the public sector literature had all been cross-sectional research and had no control variables of any substance. Casey constructed a data set with both cross-sectional and time series data and showed that you could see effects, time series that had been documented cross-sectionally. But he also went into the details of how public sector work is structured and set up a series of control variables that made sense. And so in a sense, there's that industrial relations institutional appreciation that resulted in a thorough documentation that was persuasive and convincing, exactly as Captain, you were saying, in terms of the steelwork. And then if we come forward to the steelwork again, I mean, I remember talking to Casey. He had just received tenure, right around the time that you were beginning that work, and he commented that once you have tenure, what you should do is the study that you really want to do with the detailed and thoroughness that it needs to be, and not worry about how long it takes or what's involved. The clock is no longer ticking. And so he came to that with the view that let's do this right. And there have been a number of studies, many of us here in the room, on the economic performance impacts of human resource practices. But there was still debate in the field. Are there really, economic performance differences from different bundles of practices that could be documented? And what was done with the finishing line studies was unambiguous. Everything that could be held constant as control variables were documented. The treatment variables were thorough and comprehensive, and the results were unambiguous. And it really represents the gold standard in terms of definitively answering that question. So the first thing that I want to say, kind of as a discussant, is just an appreciation for the work itself and the thorough, careful detail that Casey brought to the work that resulted in definitive work. I also will say that in talking to him about when he took on the role as head of the management division in Columbia, he was just as thorough with the budget and the staffing in a way that was really, I know, well received and remarkable. He took it on in the same way he took on any project, with care and detail, and was really seeing great results. And I know that made his loss even more acute for his colleagues at Columbia. So that's the first thing to share. The second is about the sports work, and I want to share it on a personal note. 4 years ago, I was with my son, my wife was here, and we were at the MIT Sports Analytics Conference and ran into Casey. And he was just beginning this work, and as some of you know, my son was deeply into baseball analytics. He's now the manager of business analytics with Cleveland Indians. And he and Casey struck up a friendship, and in fact, Gabe was even thinking of returning to graduate school to study with Casey. But what I wanted to share with you was, these are just segments of the email correspondence that Gabe was having with Casey, frankly, just up to a few days before his death. And what I want to highlight is that when Casey was talking to Gabe, he emphasized that he always wanted to have up-to-date ideas. He was thinking about how we can get these students so they're excited, how we can find out what's the cutting-edge stuff that the Indians are doing, that we can bring into the classroom. And again, it was that sense of thoroughness and that sense of commitment to how can we have the best possible experience for these students with the most current, most recent work that characterized everything that Casey did. But I also just wanted to share the sense in which he was really reaching out to industry to bring it into the classroom in a way that made for a remarkable experience. Gabe, of course, was a guest in his class in that first year. I had a chance to, as Ann knows, come and be a guest in Casey's negotiations class, and his teaching had that same quality that we saw in his research. The final thing that I want to share, and this now goes beyond the discussant role, is just again on the personal note. Casey was the best version of himself. That many of us aspire to be the best that we can be. But as a scholar, he produced work that was the gold standard in each area that he touched. As a teacher, and as an administrator, he did the best work that could possibly be done. And as a husband and as someone who was just deeply committed to, after he had the first incident with the aneurysm, to taking time with family in a way that had balance that I think all of us can aspire to. And so I really want to conclude with just an appreciation and a real sense of loss that Casey was a remarkable human being, and we're just privileged to have the chance to have the time that we had with him, and it wasn't anywhere near enough.
So I'm going to speak without slides, just a few more informal comments. And I'm going to focus actually on the very early period, because I knew Casey best in the early 80s when we shared an office together at NBER, 81 to 83. So I'll focus a lot, and I remember a lot more of the early papers that preceded a lot of the ones that have been discussed so far, so I'll talk about those. I have a few comments on also palling around a little with Casey outside of the office. Casey at that point roomed with a character named Paul Cody, that a few of you remember, and they lived on the second floor of Richard's house. I think it was 10 Ellery Street in Cambridge. There were a lot of great stories, great memories. I won't tell the James Brown story again, because that's been told on other occasions. And many know that story. But there were a lot of very fond memories from that period. But another circle, at that time, I was also working on the Harvard econ tutorial staff with Ann Preston. And Kathy was there until 81, and another guy named Eric Seiler. And I do remember this pretty clearly. Eric and I, and maybe one or two others, having a conversation. Casey had just broken up with some girlfriend at the time, saying, Casey, you ought to meet Ann Preston. I think that was the original, so we get a little credit for the idea. Of course, we give Ann and Casey themselves the credit for the execution of that idea. So we interacted in several different circles. And I'll start just with a thought on a personal note. And this is honestly true. Casey was the one guy I knew in grad school that I really wished I was more like in a lot of ways, because he was. Don't go there. So first of all, academically, he was very successful. Cranking out all these papers even before he got to his doctoral dissertation, and doing them all very well. And he was sort of running the NBER Labor Studies group. Richard was CEO, but Casey was COO. And really kept the group on track and very productive. But here on a personal level, you had this guy, this great guy, athletic, great sense of humor, sort of regular guy demeanor, down to earth, very comfortable in his own skin, sort of the whole package. And in a word, Casey was cool. And in the world of econ grad students, he didn't see cool every day. You insulted almost everyone in the world. Now, all the IR guys were cool all the time. And anyhow, so Casey stuck out in a lot of ways, and it was great to be around in all these different senses. So, I'll tell you sort of my view of Casey's academic work, really. I think Casey was blessed in a lot of ways. And he was blessed to have a lot of co-authors. Kathy and Jeffrey Zaks that you've heard from. Casey was blessed to have two great mentors in Tom and Richard. And in my view, Casey got two very big ideas from Tom and Richard. The influence actually went both ways, pretty clearly from what we've heard today. But two big ideas that really motivated and animated his entire work over the subsequent sort of 35 years or so. One concept, obviously, was that institutions really matter. And not just unions, which was the original focus, but also the firm, the plant, the establishment, and not just the compensation rules affecting compensation, but as the layout of the workplace, the organization of the workplace, and the whole concept of the high-performance workplace, which I think started bubbling around early in that period, and gradually, where Kathy kind of became, and Tom, of course, wrote a lot about that whole concept. Really, that idea, set of ideas, I think, that started with you guys with Casey. And then the second idea, the data idea, to really test this stuff, you got to go out and get the right data. The right data is plant, establishment, and firm level data. And data on both the HR policies and practices, and also on the organization of production, on whatever the product is. Think of where the economics profession was, circa 1980 on this stuff. most labor economists were still running, log wage equations on a union dummy with CBS data. Most. Now, a huge exception to that, the Friedman and Medoff stuff throughout the 70s, the Brown and Medoff stuff on productivity, which was starting to branch out. Can we think about these institutions more broadly? But really, by the time Casey started his work, relatively little, I think, had been done outside of that, those few examples of that kind of work. And I think to give credit where credit is due, I think the only other person I remember at that time doing this kind of stuff was James Medoff on his Inside the Black Box paper. We got one company's personnel data, and that was very different from the stuff because it wasn't about productivity and production processes. I had to believe that at some level that directly or indirectly also influenced Casey's thinking on it. It was hugely innovative. And even before sort of the dissertation, so you've heard a little bit about the police and fire papers that Casey did pretty early on. There were a couple of other papers that maybe get lost in the shuffle, but I remember Casey working on them when we were office mates that kind of reflected these early insights. And both of them used steel plant data and data from contracts, steelworker contracts. There was one paper called Have Angels Done More? A paper on affirmative action consent decrees and how they affected minority representation in the steel plants. And that title, the great title, was from a high-ranking USW official who made a comment like, "We've done so much, even angels couldn't do more than what we've done." So sort of Casey took that and tested the idea using sort of variation across plants and the consent decrees and over time and found effects. The second paper that I remember this time was looking at the extent to which the number and complexity of union work rules might have affected productivity using the number of pages in the contract as a measure of sort of the number and complexity of those rules and finding negative effects of that. Remember, this was a time when in the Cambridge, Massachusetts circles, most people were arguing for, sort of Richard and Charlie, James arguing positive effect of unions. So Casey found this negative effect, but really the idea more broadly was the effects could be positive or negative, depending on how these rules are made and how they're implemented, et cetera. So that was just sort of very early on samples of Casey's thinking even before he got to the dissertation. And then the dissertation work, I also remember very clearly, because he was, I think it was on the paper mills, and he spent that summer of '82 in Oregon, all summer in Oregon, and I have a funny memory. Remember, go back to 1982. It wasn't just like you downloaded some files electronically. It involved hundreds, thousands of pages of handwritten books that had to be Xeroxed and transcribed and typed into. And Casey hired this Harvard undergrad, whose name I don't remember. It wasn't Harrison Howe or some other kid. And I knew this was going to be miserable work. I knew this was going to have a miserable summer. I didn't have a hard time. I met the kid in June, right before he's a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Harvard undergrad. He's all pumped up and says, "Casey's giving me this great opportunity." I said, "Yeah, it's going to be great." Great time. But I think it's important to remember not only how innovative that work was, but how hard it was at that stage when Casey's doing when virtually no one else was. And a little bit from the comments of Kathy and Ann, you get the sense that to do that work right, you have to really understand the production processes, all the technicalities of the production process and get good data at that, which because in every industry is way different. Then you have to really understand the HR rules and the intersection between those rules and the layout, and that was a lot invested in each product that most economists, again, had never even thought to investigate, to incorporate into their work. So I think that's a lot of what made this work special. Now Kathy, I think, came on as a co-author, I guess, in the mid-'80s or late '80s, brought her own econometric insights, and it was a great partnership. When I think back of my cohort of labor economists, the folks that came out in that period around the early to mid-'80s, it's hard to think of another partnership, I think, that's as lasting, as productive and successful as the Ichniowski-Shaw partnership. The only one I can think of that comes close is maybe Carter-Kruger in a very different way, but it was a great partnership. And of course, Ann Bartel came on somewhat later, in the papers you talked about. But it was great work, I think. And now it's not that unusual. Think of the work of Nicholas Bloom or John Van Reen and other folks. But again, when Casey started doing it, and then Casey and Kathy, was very, very new and very innovative. And of course, I know from conversations that it's affected many other people's things. Bob Gibbons and I had a conversation where I could see how much Casey was influencing much more broadly than the empirical work. There are people thinking about the theory of firms and productivity as well. So it's just a great body of work from a really great guy. And so I would say in conclusion, we're all very sad that Casey left us so early. We're very happy and very proud about the legacy that he left, both academically and personally. And that legacy is going to remain for a very long time to come.
Well, we've had wonderful summaries and tributes to Casey as a person and his work. So many people in this room have your own stories, your own experiences with Casey, in using the work and doing work with him. So I would invite, we have almost a half an hour. Anyone who would like to make a comment, or if there's a question about the work, that's fine too, but the floor is open. I do, Bob.
Thanks, all of you guys. This is terrific, actually, thank you. Makes me realize that I knew that I met Casey relatively recently, and now I see not only a bunch of stuff that I missed, but a bunch of ways I could have met him earlier. So Harrison Lauer and I were in the same tiny freshman dorm. It wasn't the aforementioned Paul Cody or Winter Pounds. There you go. So, and I played some basketball on that court, right? And so, and I remember sitting in that office of Catherine's and trying to think about Milburn Roberts and complementary and all these, and I gave you that money for the new branches, have an attitude problem for the Citibank stuff, and I never, I see Casey's name and I just missed him all those times. So actually, looking at Eliza and Alan and people who are younger and Amanda didn't, people who come after you guys who didn't get a chance to meet Casey, I find myself thinking about ways to explain and keep things alive. And so let me come back to Andy's point about personnel economics as sort of next door to and overlapping with organizational economics. And Harry made a point about Casey helping even the theorists, right? Certainly me. And so let me end by sort of sketching that as a way, I think, to keep some of this alive in directions that might not be as obvious to the sort of straight labor and IR crowd. So, I teach the Valves paper in the complementarities part of the organizational economics PhD class, not in the personnel part, if you want to help see what some of those distinctions are. I think Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson would be surprised to hear that if anybody were to assert, which I think it is asserting, that their work on the boundary of the firm is part of personnel economics. There are parts of organizational economics that aren't part of personnel economics. And likewise, Alfred Chandler on structures in organizations would be surprised to be told that is part of personnel. And so there are lots of things in organizations that aren't really personnel, and Casey was moving to those. In fact, that's one of the things I think is so important about the chapter that Casey and Catherine did in the handbook of organizational economics is while it very much started from the fantastic AER paper that is part of the personnel, the applications in the end start looking at Pierre Azoulay on outsourcing in the pharmaceutical industry and stuff like that, right? So one can take these ideas and these metrics and look at all parts of organizational economics, including structures and processes inside the person level and the boundary and contracts between firms and all of that. So, Anne knows she has an open invitation to come give the soccer paper in the NBR meeting anytime, and I hope it's soon. But beyond that, I have some pictures that I showed to that group 2 meetings ago, and I don't know for how long I'll keep showing pictures to my graduate class. You guys, some of the veterans of that class have seen other pictures on other occasions, but I certainly will keep teaching this raft of papers in a whole set of ways.
Thank you, Bob. So,
Hi, I'm Saul Rubenstein. I'm at Rutgers University, and I got to know Casey, I think, really through Tom. It must have been probably the dinner that you host every year in Lyra. Casey was years ahead of me at MIT, but Tom introduced us. And I think the first time I really got a chance to sit down with him might have been an NSF meeting in Washington, because we were both doing work. I was doing work with Tom in the auto industry, trying to understand General Motors Saturn Corporation. Casey and Kathy were doing work in the steel industry, and we were interested in modeling collaboration and talking about using network analysis to do that. It could have been an industry studies group in Washington that Sloan was hosting, but I think it was an NSF meeting. And what struck me at first is that Casey was so well known, and yet he had time for a graduate student, and he had time to sit and talk as long as I wanted to talk, many questions as I wanted to ask, and he was really interested and encouraging of the work that I was doing, and asked to keep in touch. And over the years, we did keep in touch. And most recently, some of you know, I've been doing work on public school reform, and interested again in this issue of institutional collaboration and partnerships in schools, and how that affects teachers and teaching quality, and also student achievement and student performance. And I got stuck on a problem a couple of years ago about how to represent this easily, not in an academic paper, but also in a public policy document, where I could graph the findings that we had that showed that, in fact, collaboration among teachers has a strong effect on student performance. But we were controlling for poverty, which was terribly important, but I didn't know how to graph this stuff. And I called Casey, because I know he had done this in the Steels work with you, and I know he had a technique, and I didn't know the technique. I got him on the phone, and he had all the time in the world. Essentially, he was using residuals to control for poverty, and yet still just show partnership and performance. He took all the time, was really encouraging, gave me everything I wanted, and then said, and I want to know more about this. So please send me the drafts. I'd like to hear it. I'd like to hear where this work is going. And he just couldn't have been more encouraging, and he always was. He always had time, and I just really valued him as a colleague, and I miss him.
thank you, Saul. One of the things that Kathy said that I firmly believe in, and I think it reflects a lot of what we do and why we go out into the field and why we have mixed methodologies, is Casey was committed to finding truth. I think we can find that your quantitative analysis is consistent with the insights you get from qualitative, from interviewing, from spending time in the field. That's when you know you might be close to truth. It's when the two don't fit together in your own head. That's when you know you've got a lot more work to do. And I think that if we take nothing else away from this conversation today, kind of keep that thought in mind as we go forward, I think we get much deeper understanding, better research, and maybe more impact with the work, because you can also then use the combination, the data, the regression coefficients, the graphs, and the insights of the interviews with the soccer players and someone to say, yeah, I really believe it, and therefore I can really convey it in a way that can help you understand. I think that's really, really a trademark of what Casey stands for and what our field stands for, and why this organization, more than any other, really continues to be important.
Yeah, I just want to express appreciation for this really very special time and inspiring. Those of us, who would be labeled institutionalists, that's what you were just saying, Tom, saw Casey, as in a sense the new frontier, the breath of fresh air. I'm sure he consulted with Phyllis Wallace when he did that paper on affirmative action. Another person, who knew the institutions and was able, in a sense, to create the openings for Casey. I created an opening for him, as Tom mentioned, in the paper industry. And those of us who would poke around these industries, a lot about steel and the other industries, would just step back and just marvel, at the insights that we never got as institutionalists, that Casey was there, and as people have said, set in motion a way forward for our new PhD students to be both grounded and also analytical. And it's such a powerful combination that Casey represents.
Go ahead. Bruce.
Well, I just kind of want to thank you for doing the time to do all this for him. He sort of downplayed his accomplishments. So keeping them down there totally makes it's very, very great.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. We're all supportive of this. I think Ann's right. Casey, maybe inside, something had to drive him, and maybe it was an internal ego. But Casey was always really interested in the issues and engaging us. 5 or 6 people have now said, and so I don't think he would be willing to recognize the impact that he has had on this field. I was just putting together my course outline a little late for next semester, and there's going to be one module on firms inside HR systems. And what's the first paper they're going to read? So Ichniowski show up paper on finishing lines and 2 or 3 others that are very important in that line of work. And that's the kind of impact that I think he would appreciate, and that maybe he might even recognize.
So obviously, we're all colleague Casey's from Columbia, and I don't know Casey anywhere as long as we've spoken here. But I did have the chance to meet Casey early in his career when he came by to Columbia. He handled actually the natural science paper, which came out in Japanese and U.S. comparison. And a lot of his work overlapped with work with John Paul Duffy. I just want to say this, and maybe this is maybe it's a little risk to say this, but I will say this if you wish. And I was working with Casey on a pretty extensive piece of research. To be honest with you, it's got to be much bigger than we can imagine. It's in India, it had to do with microfinance and a lot of branches. It was out in rural parts of India. It's tough. Casey came back, told the classic Casey stories about talking to people and all that kind of issues. But it was really hard. And in dealing with him, I was trying to figure out how Casey works. And I think this Catherine story getting about the phone makes so much sense. And Casey really liked that. He really liked being left alone. He liked to work with people. He also liked to be left alone to puzzle through things. And when he kind of worked with these things a little bit, he would kind of come back and tell you what's going on. It was kind of an unusual work pattern, which maybe you trained him to have to on this thing, but because he's really thinking very, very deeply about these issues. I knew his work, part of it. I'm kind of puzzled sometimes with why it's not. It was very well known, but I'm not puzzled why it's not even better known. And maybe he was a very modest man. I'd like to think you don't have to do all that more marketing, but maybe you have to do a bit of that. I'm not sure. It's extremely modest. One of the things which has happened since Casey died is, for me, because I didn't know him as well as you guys have, I've learned so much about Casey. Going back to the NDR days forward, and no wonder he ran the department well. He was already running these sections.
Managing Richard.
Good training. When I got to this department, which kind of was the story, the Columbia story in part, and I think the largest story as well, how this group was going to divide up between the next part and econ, and Casey probably was going in other direction. His heart was in another direction, I think, quite honestly. And you often come back puzzled by why no one ever talks about identification or causality. I think he drove a lot of his colleagues crazy over the decades. I came in late, I think over the decades, about this issue, and they're not, you know, he was quiet about it in some ways, but occasionally he'd go back to his office and put his hands up and say, you know, a whole you know, seminar on regressions without a discussion of the cost of identification. So these things are on his mind. They had the organization chart. It had the OB group, it had the OT group, it had the strategy group, it had the other column, which Ray Horton and Casey belonged to. And to me, it was puzzle. What he was doing is the heart of productivity that drives the profits of companies. Why should that be the other column? It is department management. It was absolutely bizarre in this whole story. We start by $2.5 million for the research effort. I was actually involved with when I was living in Europe, giving money to the Bloomberg effort. That was about $2.5 to $3 million as well. It's expensive research. People have to do this work well. You don't want to give the money to people who are going to blow the money. You know, he obviously is a person who won institutional confidence, which is doesn't mean all often talk about. But he got that institutional confidence. People give him the money to fund this kind of research. I guess my only thing I wanted to say is that if Casey was too modest, and I think that's true. I think he was very modest. I think he was I think he was comfortable with his skin. Maybe that's why he could survive this sort of, you know, contradiction, which I see here, is how much he has done and how much, you know, more he should have known for what he has done. I think, you know, that this is kind of the time. The questions raised by all of you in Casey's research really are the questions of today. Why don't we see better progress? It's the title of many books about why there's poverty, what makes the country poor, etc. But it comes down to stuff at the micro level. And I'm just hoping that maybe through your efforts, our efforts, a number of people will think about these issues. But that's not going to be enough. There has to be some sort of architecture around these issues. I do hope there is some thinking about what it means to create an architecture intellectually. So not only for Casey, but for what Casey represents, so that has more energy and more impact. And maybe that would basically bring so much to Casey.
Anyone else? That might be a good benediction to finish on. What's the long-term legacy? Maybe it's the architecture of doing this kind of research, with a commitment and passion for understanding, for having an impact with it, for making sure that it's done well, but also done in a way that you can then bring it to the classroom, that you can carry on, and next generation and generations of students to follow will not only read and understand, but come to appreciate it, maybe emulate in some ways. If we do our job right, that's